can stop playing the piano now, Dan, thanks.
He's a man of many talents. Right, welcome to our second talk at Vitamin C at the Quay. Keith had an absolutely blinding talk last year, and he's going to once again blow your minds with what Southern Watee are trying to do on the island to make our water safe. So Keith Herbert is the area manager for Southern Water on the Isle of Wight, and I think he described himself as he wants to make the water quality better because he is a keen paddleboarder and canoeist, but generally spends more time in the water than on it, due to his skill level. Keith, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me back. You all probably got a very vested interest in what I'm about to talk about, as have I. Last year, when I presented at this event, I gave an overview of what we do in terms of our wastewater operation, how that works, the legalese around that, what we can do, what we can't do, and also how that impacts on water quality. I see a few faces that I recognise, so I'm not just going to go and repeat the same presentation, but I see a few new faces as well. So I plan to use the first 5-10 minutes just to go over that, because it's a very technical subject, B, it's a very emotive subject, there's a lot of misinformation and water companies aren't very good at getting their point across. So I just ask that you approach this with an open mind. I'll have a good section at the end for Q&A, and then you can tear scripts off me in that section there. So yeah, first slide please. So we've got some nice diagrams from corporate now, which is what I didn't have last year when I made it on Microsoft Paint. So this is basically what our sewage system looks like. During dry weather, foul flow, so that is flow from toilets, showers, dishwashers, washing machines, flows down into a wastewater treatment works where it is treated to a very high standard and released to the environment. Happy days. So that's what happens when, on a dry day like today, that's what happens during normal operation. Click. He's got it. When we get a storm or appreciably heavy rainfall, we live in a part of the world where the combined or the stormwater system is not separate from the fan, so it's just one pipe under most roads. So downpipes from people's roofs, highway gullies from the public highway, from the roads, and open spaces, all that water goes into the same pipe, which drains the same water from our showers, toilets, dishwashers, etc. So when the rain comes over, the excess water washes into the same pipe, and the wastewater treatment works that treats it cannot treat all flow for a variety of reasons, which I discussed at the last one, but for those of you who weren't there, A, permitting, we're not allowed to treat the additional flow. Most treatment is predicated upon biological action, so when you feed them rainwater, you effectively starve them. And you get into a kind of diminishing return of building bigger concrete things for what is almost exclusively rainwater. So when that happens, and the wastewater treatment works are beaten, we have what's called a storm tank to hold and detain the flow. And in most storms, we don't discharge, the storm tank holds the flow, and it's slowly returned once the storm is over. Click. During a very heavy storm, typically more than 10 millimetres of rain. The flow from the downpipes, the highway gullies, the open areas completely beats the sewage treatment works, which is still running, but albeit can only accept a certain amount of flow. The storm tank is full, and then, and only then, are we allowed to discharge to the environment via storm settlement tank and screen to screen out things that shouldn't be there in the first place, like wet wipes, sanitary products, etc. So that's a kind of very rough overview of what combined sewer overflows are and why they happen. Click. So for the foreseeable future, so to 50 years, they will always be an absolute necessary part of the drainage system. Because if they were not there, homes, businesses, schools would back up and flood. If you were going to do this all over again, you would have a completely separate system. You would have a system that conveys rainwater and stormwater to the environment because it doesn't need treating, and then you have a power system that goes through treatment works. We don't have that. Unfortunately, we have to retrospectively manage it, which is the content of this presentation. So CSOs, or combined sewer overflows, are here for the mid to long term, and they protect homes and businesses from flooding, as that diagrammatic shows what would happen if we popped it up very crudely. Next slide, please. Just a bit on water companies and how they're regulated. Every 5 years, we go to the regulator saying, this is all the good stuff that we want to do. And the regulator goes, okay, well, here's the money that you're going to get, and here's how much you can charge our customers to do that. So this is a kind of snapshot, this slide, which is quite busy, of all the investment that the Isle of Wight is getting for the period of 2020 to 2025. And as you can see in the top left, that's all the wastewater investment. And you can see that Sandown is getting £15 million to increase the flow. It's going to get increasing storm storage, but what that is not going to do is appreciably, I say quite appreciably, I'm talking 10-20%, reduce the volume of combined sewer overflows that we're going to have. A lot of that work is statutory, i.e. the Environment Agency has mandated us to do it, so we don't have a choice whether we do it or not, because the permits of some of the sites are varying. So that investment is locked in, we can't get out of it, we're compelled to deliver that. And that is basically the plan that we're going to carry out for the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So, also what happened since I gave the talk at the last Vitamin C was the Environment Bill came out, and that got signed and has been written into law, and that places a mandate on water companies to, and the exact wording is, progressively reduce the impact of combined sewer overflows. So it's quite a general statement, and it gives water companies a fair amount of wriggle room, but what that does is cause water companies to set a baseline. So if you were going to progressively reduce the impact of something, you need to know what you're starting at. And a lot of what water companies get in terms of challenge is, well, the Environment Agency takes samples of beaches once every week during the summer as part of their bathing water monitoring programme. That's just one point in time. So you could have a discharge on Saturday and the sample could be taken on Thursday. You've got no idea what's going on for the rest of the week on that single point in time. So the way that we're combating that is to have real-time water quality monitoring data. So we're trialling 3 buoys. What the closest to here is going to be in Hayling Island, that's going to be sitting monitoring water quality 24/7. And the idea is that's going to supersede beach buoys. So rather than going to the dumb beach buoy system that says we have or haven't had a discharge, we'll be able to log on and understand what the water quality is real time. So that's the goal, and that's how we're approaching the Environment Bill, which all water companies are generally supportive of, because it allows us, because water companies are painted as companies that don't want to do this stuff. Generally they do. There's just quite a lot of constraints in the way that stop them delivering ultimately what we want. And the inflexibility of the way that we're regulated means that what we wanted to do in 2020, there's been a real big sea change in customer expectation and what people want us to do. So the next price review, which is going to be 2025 to 2030, that's going to be where all this stuff's going to get put in to say, we think we can reduce overflows by 80% if we do this. And ultimately it's going to be Ofwat's decision whether they go ahead and fund that. Click. So before I go on to the plan and the strategy, which I did not have at Vitamin C last year, I just wanted to come just brief what my team and I are actually going to be doing. So outside of all that investment plan and outside of what our regulators are saying, we've got a plan to reduce overflows by 80%. The investment plan that we have and is locked in wouldn't enable us to deliver that, but we're doing this above and beyond what we're being asked to do, such as the strength of feeling regarding it. And it won't involve building bigger works or building bigger pumps, as I explained in the last Vitamin C. That's not really the best way to go about it, in my opinion, because you get diminishing returns quite quickly. The project will focus on holistic water management. What does that mean? So it really means looking at nature-based solutions to divert, remove, attenuate the flow coming in from gullies, downpipes, etc., and stop it overwhelming our sewer apparatus as quickly as it does. So we hope to have that plan together by the end of the year, so we can go to the regulators and say, this is how we're going to do it. So just a word, we've also done some research on the composition of our average CSO discharge. So during the average CSO discharge, what goes out and is released to the environment is over 95% rainwater. So for that reason, my personal choice is that I wouldn't have a problem bathing or going out with my children to any of the beaches on the Isle of Wight, storm or no storm, but then that's personal preference. Of that 95%, we also, through flow monitoring, know where it comes from. So about 40% of the flow comes from roads. So highway gullies, those little metal things that you see down the curb, most of the flow comes from there. 40% comes from domestic properties, downpipes. So if you look at somewhere like Cowes, you see rows and rows of lovely Victorian housing. All of that roof space runs off the roofs into the downpipe straight into the sewer, overwhelming it. And then 15% comes from gardens and open spaces and eventually ends up in the foul sewer. So just looking at the way that our sewage works and pumping stations respond to that, if we get 40% of that water out of the system, we can cut discharges by 80%. And that's what we plan to do over the next 5 years. And I appreciate that a lot of what comes out of big companies is just kind of sayings and rhetoric. So the rest of the presentation will be talking through exactly how we are going to do that. So here are the statistics for 2020, which is the baseline around specific sub-catchments. So pretty much all the sewage on the Isle of Wight, especially from the towns, is pumped to stand down here where it's treated. So we've broken that down into a series of sub-catchments and looked at how many times CSOs have discharged versus the population, and therefore ranked it into what that looks like. And we've got 4 sub-catchments: Cowes, Bembridge, Yarmouth and Fishbourne, which are a lot higher than the rest in terms of their population versus their spill. And that's where we're going to be targeting our projects. And as part of that, we kind of need to characterise what a spill looks like. Is it coming from tidal? Because sometimes the tide comes in, overwhelms the sewer. That would be quite difficult to solve. Sometimes it comes from groundwater gets into the sewer. Or is it just a flashy catchment where there's so much hard standing, there's so much development that it all just washes into the sewer? So we need to go and characterise those catchments to find out exactly why and what is causing some of these spills to occur. In the instance of Fishbourne and Wootton in that area, there's a lot of bungalow city up by Tesco Express where there's a huge hard standing area. When Wootton Creek comes in, it overwhelms the sewer, which causes CSO alarms there. And a lot of the apparatus, they have telemetry issues there because they run off radio link. And of course, when it loses the radio link, when someone parks their car in front of it, it can't talk to our telemetry. And that gives you an example of what actually happens when you look on Beach Boy, an alarm goes off, but it's not verified. That's what's happening, generally just due to signal issues, or a tea towel or a wet wipe is wrapped around the instrument that actually measures the spill. So that can give you an insight to what goes on at Beach Boy. Next slide, please. So, number one, what are we going to do about it? So, get our sites in order. So a lot of what we're going to do is going to require public acceptance. So we've got no right telling people to manage their surface water or dig a soakaway if we're not getting our own sites in order. So that's going to be number one, what we do. So the first one I think is going to have the most benefit is pumping optimization. So just looking at the Isle of Wight, everything pumps to Sandown. So pumping stations in Newport pump there, Ventnor pumps there, Rye pumps there. All the planets could align, and all those pumps could pump at the same time, thus overwhelming the site. Unlikely, and you could have a dry weather spill, but there's nothing at the moment to stop that happening. Of course, when you get a rainfall, Ventnor, the pumping station, the bandstand on the seafront, has a lot of storage, and you saw that the previous one is right at the bottom. That will pump to Sandown irrespective of whether it's wet or not. We could store storage there to prioritise other catchments over others, thus juggling the water around to stop it spilling in a more kind of holistic system. It's quite complicated, but welcome questions afterwards. Although I said pumping more and treating more doesn't form the bulk of it, there are instances where we can pump more and can treat more, but then that needs risk assessing, because generally pumping more is at the expense of the quality of the treated effluent. If you pump more, it's more dilute. If the bugs don't like it, they die off, you get poorer quality effluent. So that does need to be risk assessed. And then SUDS, which is a horrible acronym for Sustainable Urban Drainage. So we have quite a few large buildings, we have quite a few large hard standing areas. We need to practice as we preach and not have that going into the public foul sewer where it overwhelms because it causes more discharges. Connectivity. So here is another diagrammatic of Wootton. So this is up from New Road, up on the estate, just behind kind of Wine Warehouse and where the Tesco Express is. And the blue line is a surface water sewer. And the purple line is a foul sewer. And as you can see, they meet. There is no reason for that. That's just a builder being lazy. And that surface water sewer, so that 300 millimetres, so it's a good foot, that can take 80 litres a second. It's a huge amount of water. And that is water that does not need treating. And it's plugged into the valve. So first of all, we need to look at these connections and find out where they're going, and ultimately look at how we remove them safely so they don't overwhelm the public foul sewer. And depressingly or optimistically, depending on what way you look at it, I found over 100 examples of these across the island. Most towns, there are misconnections where someone has erroneously put the surface water sewer into the foul. Large impermeable areas. So we've got very clever mapping systems that have marked large impermeable areas in red. So this isn't on the Isle of Wight, this is in Hastings, and you can see the large buildings have been coloured in red. Our plan for that is to go door to door, knock on the door and say, we're going to give you a free drainage survey, and the property owner will get a free drainage survey, but we will ultimately know where their impermeable surface drains to. And if it drains to the public foul sewer, our ambition is to do something about it and divert it elsewhere where it isn't going to cause combined sewer overflows. And you can also see there's green areas, which is areas which could be suitable for a soakaway, or permeable areas where we could potentially divert. And I've also asked our consultants who did this to mark roads of a certain width yellow, and I'll talk about why I've asked them to do that in a couple of slides' time. Water butts. So your average water butt is about 350 litres, and that could detain a summer storm. So just going back to my statement that 40% of the flow comes from domestic routes, if every house on the Isle of Wight had a water butt, theoretically you could remove 40% of the flow. And if we remove 40% of the flow, we can reduce discharges by 80%. So this is no ordinary water butt. This is what's called a smart water butt. Because if you go down B&Q and get a water butt, once it's full, it's full. It offers no benefit whatsoever. This smart water butt is connected to the internet, and it knows when it's going to rain. And it slowly drains itself back into the system when it knows a rainstorm is coming. So again, we plan to roll these out on a huge scale, door to door, to give people free water butts to stop that flow coming in. an overwhelming system. Tell your friends. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things with all of these is it needs to be provable. And the area that I'm going to prove it is Haven Street, because Haven Street is a kind of, it's got a lot of problems in terms of the way the water's managed in Haven Street. It's controllable. I can do all of these things in Haven Street and then go back and say, it works, I want more money, I want to do it in Benbridge, I want to do it in Newport, I want to do it everywhere. So next slide. Highway drainage. So 40% of the flow comes from highways, and purely because there's a large amount of concrete hard standing where the water just runs off. Some of the slides I'm going to show you here are examples of what's called sustainable urban drainage. On the left, you can see kind of permeable block paving with slight gaps and a soak away underneath. So rather than just run off, the water soaks down. On the top right, you can see an example of what's called a tree pit. Some of these are starting to catch on in towns and cities. They actually contribute towards local authorities' tree planting targets. And the cross-section underneath, you can see what's going on underneath, is the kind of root complex of the tree, but also a larger soak away. So whereas an ordinary highway gully would just deposit its water in the sewer, this deposits it in the soak away for the tree to use. Obviously when it becomes full and it goes in anyway. But we're not trying to eliminate discharges. I don't think that's reasonable at this stage. We're trying to reduce them. And the way that we reduce them is to slow the flow. Here's some more examples of that kind of philosophy. On the left, you can see a kind of traffic calming island, which has been fitted into a soakaway. So you can see the water would normally race down the left-hand side, go into a gully, where it now goes into a kind of attractive little garden where it offers some sort of stormwater retention. The one in the middle is called a pocket gully or a swale. So rather than traditionally have gullies that intersect the flow, the water just runs off into that swale, soaks away. And in the top right, you have a rain garden, a grass roof, which we're engaging with the local authorities to try and have every bus stop to have a grass roof, because bus stops are serial offenders in terms of flow running off. It isn't just doing stuff and building things. Policy change is required as well. You'll notice that highway drainage, domestic roof, and open spaces, that is not the preserve of water companies. We have no control over what goes on in that currently. And in terms of planning applications, our job is to equip local authorities with the tools and policies to create sustainable development. Water companies are not statutory consultancies. We do not get a say on developments. We have no control who connects into public cloud sewer and who doesn't. So we've given the local authority feedback on the Highland Plan about what they should and shouldn't be accepting in terms of acceptable development, and we need to carry on that. Internally, you'll see in your water bill, you have a surface water charge. We're reviewing those surface water charges to incentivise customers who wish to disconnect their surface water drainage from their foul, thus taking us a step back to two separate systems, which is the goal. This slide here, most important thing is this graph, which is the slow flow. This is what we're trying to do. So as things stand, the blue sharp peak is what hits our sewers and our treatment works after a storm. Our desire is to get it to the more broad green peak through attenuated flow by using all those methods that I talked through. And there's a kind of diagrammatic of all of those methods contributing towards one another. So, just a bit of discussion before I open it up to questions. The majority of flow comes from apparatus not managed by water companies, and the bulk of my presentation last time was one really around how we can't just keep on building bigger, pumping more, because the environmental benefit of pumping more, the CO2 footprint of doing that, doesn't really offset the kind of environmental impact of discharging. It just doesn't work. It's too much CO2 created, it's too much power. Can be effective, but not always. So the only way that CSOs are going to be tackled is lots of people working together along this. It requires water companies to kind of reach out to local authorities, to customers, and work with them to stop the flow coming in, because that's what it's all about. That's it. Any questions? Yes?
So have you got a department or something where a private person can go and get some guidance on what to do with their drainage system?
Yes, yes we have. So I was introduced as the area manager for the Isle of Wight, but I've recently just taken the job to run this project. It's a dedicated staff project to do this. So it's important to say that no one has ever done this before. It's the first time anyone's ever attempted something on this scale. We will fail, we will make mistakes, but part of what I said about Haven Street is getting something that's repeatable that we can do elsewhere. So I want to focus all of our efforts in Haven Street, prove that it works. So if anyone's lucky enough to live in Haven Street, you'll be getting a knock at the door and all of this stuff. But prior to that happening, there's a lot of stuff that homeowners can do to help.
Can I make a comment? We're in the process of purchasing a property in Bednar, and like everybody, most people, you have a survey done, and the survey included some action points on drainage and whatever. And the solution that was suggested wasn't anything like what you're talking about. And I just wondered whether you are engaging with surveyors and people like that who are actually advising homeowners or potential homeowners about things like drainage.
So ultimately, any developments or changes that occur to buildings need to be signed off by the local authority through the planning process, through building regulations, etc. And through working with the local authority, it was my view that planners and enforcement, they weren't necessarily backed up by policy. If the local authorities have got the policy, they can hold the developers to account. And you shouldn't see examples of what I showed you of a big surface water line going into a fallow. That shouldn't happen. So in answer to your question, I think individual private surveyors and builders, probably not, but local authority planning officers, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, just one more quick one. Because this is a Victorian property, so it's an adaptation of an existing system and a minor thing which wouldn't demand planning or anything like that. So, and there's an awful lot of that sort of stuff going on in Ireland.
Well, hopefully the surveyor and the builder will be acting in your best interests and saying, you do this, this will be the cheapest and this will work for you. In a lot of instances that would be right, but in a lot of instances it is in everyone's best interest just to get rid of the water on their land and dispose of it in the public foul sewer. That's fine, but people are making it absolutely clear that they don't like CO2 discharges. The two things are incompatible. People are going to have to look at their responsibility in all this. Where does everyone in this room, where does your downpipe go? Have you had your drive block paved? All of those questions is a personal responsibility in managing what you manage. Any more questions? Yes?
Somebody said this morning that they swam at Gurnard and they're pretty sure they saw poo in the water. That's not happening, is it? You cannot, if you see turds in the water, it will not have come from the CSO.
Alas, most schools do not make it much beyond the U bend, unfortunately. And
Unfortunately.
it depends how immature you are. Me being very immature, yeah. But yeah, schools break down, and the composition of sewage, as in its pure form, is 99.9% water. And most of our outfalls are pumped outfalls, which means an impeller going around at an extraordinary rate. So the notion of seeing kind of intact jobbies in the sea, that doesn't really happen, I'm afraid. Rag, yes, because wet wipes do not break down. Sanitary products do not break down. If you see that, call it in. But outside of storm, if there's been a release, it means we've broken the law, and it needs to be reported to us immediately. So kind of get these anecdotal reports, this and that, phone it in. A, we could do something about it, and B, we'll probably get prosecuted and fined and we'll stop doing it. That's my view on it.
So it's more likely to be dog poo or...
I mean, well, you can log on to Beach Boy and find out exactly what's been going on.
Can you just explain what Beach Boy is to people?
Okay, so Beach Boy is a reporting application. So for all the bathing water beaches on the south coast, any outfall that has the potential to impact water quality, you can now log on and see if it's discharged within the last 72 hours. So, yes.
So I think you said that you were going to close down the Beach Boy application and use this only in Australian Island.
No, there's no plans to close Beach Boy.
What did you say about Beach Boy?
It will likely be superseded by real-time water quality monitoring data, because Beach Boy purely tells you if there has and hasn't been a discharge. Now, that doesn't tell you an awful lot in terms of water quality for a number of reasons. Most of our outfalls are designed to take into account sensitivity of the receiving water course, the dilution factor, the tides, all of those things. So, could I say hand on heart there's a direct relationship between discharges and water quality? In some cases I don't think there is. In some cases there are, in some cases there aren't. What real-time water quality monitoring data would do is just remove that argument. You could just log on and see exactly what the water quality data is at that point.
Presumably that's quite a long way ahead. Because at the moment, a lot of us on the island, certainly where we swim, are looking at Beach Boy and saying, seeing that there's a feeder discharge, so we won't swim there, you just don't want to. You may say that you want to take the kids there, but you don't want to take mine. So that's one aspect of it, and it's going to be something really important, but Hayden Island isn't near where I live in beyond Wight. So it's a really long-term measure, isn't it? And when you were saying that you're going to roll out the electronic water butts across the island, you're actually going to do a pilot to Hayden Street. So you're clearly very nice to have. And you've given us a lot of information, and it's been really, really useful and very helpful. But it does seem that your sort of position in the company is a bit of a victim of local authorities and government policies and everything else. Then you made you sort of work on a 39% profit margin, and that profit should have been going into this stuff before now. So it's been very useful. Thank you very much. But
So just on a couple of those points, you have to trial things. You can't just do it on a large scale and find out it doesn't work. And I emphasise the point that all of this hasn't been done before. So our goal is to try it. Might not be successful, but there's you can't just go and get a real-time water quality monitoring board for good reason, because the Environment Agency samples intestinal enterococci and E. coli. That needs to be grown in Petri dish overnight. So the idea of having it real time, again, it's a novel technology that isn't used. And I think one of the things is that water companies, as the previous presenter said straight to Southern Watee about water quality, we're not the only source of pollution. And I think if I had to name but a few, farming, road runoff, dogs on the beach, I'd say that there's probably a few more contenders for that. And just because water companies are doing all this stuff, it doesn't remove some of the other contaminants to this. So Haven Street is where it's going to be proved, but the whole of the island is in scope of this project, and it's been going 6 months. We're not going to see results immediately. If we just kind of go around slapdash making interventions, we can't judge the success of them. And that's what we need to do. We need to establish the baseline, and then work our way forward on that.
no, I wasn't suggesting that you go about it so dash. I was suggesting that you go seriously into proper investment, and you should have done that before now.
Well, I think, again, it depends what you call proper investment. So, Shanklin had a big storm tank built 5 years ago, just at the top of Arthur's Hill. That cost £3 million to build. Shanklin had 5 spills on average every summer. Now, with £3 million, it has 3 spills per summer on average. That's not good business. I say that £3 million would be better spent on upstream countermeasures to remove that water so it doesn't go downhill and overwhelm Cove Beach. That's my view, and I think it's backed up by the facts. So just piling investment into concrete, which A, causes loads of CO2, and then the apparatus that is put there. I mean, a cubic metre of water weighs a tonne, and coming into Sandown sewage works when it rains is 3,000 litres per second. That's 3 tonnes a second. So water companies use about 5% of the national grid. 1 to 2% of the CO2 in this country is released by water companies just pumping rainwater on the surface. That has to stop. It's not the right way to do it. And a lot of these novel techniques have kind of placemaking schemes as well. They make places look nicer. If you have open areas and trees and swales by the side of the road, it kind of helps the local authority with their kind of ambition to make it a nicer place to live. So I'm kind of in favour of the upstream methods. Any more questions? Yes?
To what extent is the local authority here listening and following on what we're doing?
So we've got a working group, and the local authority have got 3 people on that working group spanning kind of planning and drainage. And as you'd imagine, Island Roads have quite a lot of input in this. And as I said, a lot of the stuff draining in there doesn't belong to water companies, and we're going to have to think about other ways of doing it, whether we pay Island Roads to deliver this stuff on our behalf. That's what we're looking at the moment. And schools are a big part of it as well. If you think of your average school, it's got a playground, drains into the foul sewer. It's got a big kind of footprint in terms of the roof that drains into the foul sewer as well. We're looking at other things such as planters for schools. So the downpipes, rather than go in, they go onto a planter that the children can use for gardening, etc. It's just got to look at things in a slightly different way. Yes, sir.
I guess a lot of this is about the speed at which you could invest to do this. And I guess the question I'm kind of sensing from you is, it hasn't been done that quickly in the past. Now the government have finally kind of twisted their arm a little bit and taken it a bit more seriously. Use the company. But just how seriously are you now going to speed up the investments that you do make on the kind of thing you're talking about?
So the point I was trying to get across is the investment, which is not insignificant, won't solve this. So a lot of this investment we are kind of tied into because the Environment Agency says we want you to do these things by law. We have to do these things by law. The project to reduce CO2 discharges by 80% before 2030 is discretionary. We don't have to do that. We want to do it. If you're going to kind of link it back to the legislation, I think DEFRA has got a white paper out that is going to mandate us to do it by 2050. So we're going to have to do it eventually. In terms of what we actually want to do, these aren't big scale, big cost investments. You know, digging up some of the roads to divert the drains, that's going to be quite expensive. But some of the smaller stuff, like building swales, putting water butts in, that's not expensive. And we just want to find out the success of this, how it works, before we kind of roll it out across the southeast.
I guess the question is, you've got the 2030 time scale for the imposed standards. These other things that are going on, what's the kind of speed of investment in that?
Well, the Environment Agency puts finite dates on the end of them, most of which are 2024. So that slide that I showed you with all the investment has got to be done by that date. Victoria?
There was on one of your slides it said how much money was being spent to remove phosphates.
Yes.
What about nitrates? Or is that just a far harder chemical process to do?
We're kind of, every sewage treatment works has a permit, and I kind of went through it with the last one, but in not so many words, it tells you exactly how much flow you should be required to treat, and exactly the quality of the effluent that comes out in terms of turbidity, ammonia, and phosphate. So the Environment Agency has gone and changed all the phosphate permits on the Isle of Wight, which has caused us to invest in phosphate removal. So in terms of nitrate, there's a few measures that you could measure by proxy, such as biological organic demand, which we measure, but generally there's no specific determinant for phosphate.
So can I say one more thing? The tours.
Yes.
Where do they go?
We're offering tours to stakeholders, but soon we're going to launch a website where members of the public can sign up and be shown around Sandown Sewage Works. We can't have a date yet.
It's fascinating.
We're working on it.
Absolutely fascinating. And very last thing, I think Keith said that the overflows never stop me swimming. They never stop me swimming anywhere. And the one in Sandown Bay is over a kilometre offshore. The only fish I've ever seen on the beach is from the Thorneton-Field. As a pretty sad personal.
Personal choice, yeah. But I think water companies aren't the statutory agency to measure water quality or public health. You know, the sole preserve of sewers and sewage treatment. The Environment Agency manage the statutory agency responsible for land, air and water, and the local authority are responsible for managing public health. So that creates a kind of muddled picture as to who's responsible for what. But I take the view that we've got to get our sites in order, and there's a great way of looking at how that's going through Beach Board. So Beach Board does have its place. I understand people use it, but it doesn't exactly tell you what the water quality is doing at that point in time.
Do you notify in advance the discharge? Beach Boy is historic.
It's
So
near.
72 hours, then you wouldn't need to make a report, you'll have a choice.
It's near real time, so it's more or less as is. So if the site discharges within 5 minutes, it will go red for 24 hours, and then after 24 hours, it will go yellow for 72 hours. So that's how Beach Boy works. So, and that's how we notify our customers that every discharge that we have has to be reported to the Environment Agency.
But if it's unverified, it means that there's an error in the system rather than an actual discharge.
Yes.
Well, can we say a big thank
Thank you.
you? Thank you. Thank you ever so much, everyone. We've now got a break until 2 o'clock when we're showing a film called Big Swim. So go out, enjoy the sunshine, get a drink, something to eat downstairs, and go and check out Riverfest. Anyway, see you all later. Thank you.
Oh, and the Mermaid Mermaid has arrived. This is not a swim to stand there.